I would like to welcome everyone back. What we're going to be doing today is discussing the vision of public administration articulated by Dwight Waldo. Now, what we're going to see Waldo stand as someone who is very much a contrarian, and especially in regards to Taylor, Mayo, and Simon. What he is really going to do is set his sights on both classical and behavioral administration. He's going to find them deeply problematic because they overlook one of the most important aspects of organizational life, and that is the political. We need to take a step back and look at what values motivate and animate certain people in public spaces. And so what we're going to be doing today is looking at the thought of Waldo and his critique of the dominant public administration literature and understanding of how it views itself, and then look at basically who is influenced by Waldo. We're going to look at one of his students, Fredrickson, and the articulation of his vision of public administration, and then we're going to look at a different group of scholars who argue that the field needs to be refounded on constitutional norms. But before we get there, let's briefly look at Waldo's critique of public administration. And what he does is very nicely kind of articulate the basic underlying philosophy of what is classical management, as really expressed by Taylor. And really, it's rooted in this idea is that progress can be achieved through a planned society, that technocrats can rule. And you really see this through the expression of the New Deal and Great Society, is that these technocratic individuals who run these large public organizations can fix the problems of society through standardization, documentation, through these huge bureaucratic instruments. However, Waldo points out that this progressive vision of public administration betrayed democracy, that there is no best way, as Taylor articulated, and he questioned our deep belief that science, at least in regards to its application in social affairs, can solve these issues. And so what he really did is reject the dichotomy. That if we really look at the politics administration dichotomy as articulated by Woodrow Wilson, that is not the proper way to view administration. Now, after he attacked the classical approach, he then set his sights on the behavioral understanding of public administration. And this behavioral approach really pushed the field to look at patterns. Patterns becomes a huge buzzword of how to administer properly. And what this behavioral approach did that was very smart is that it began to distinguish itself from the classical approach by really embedding itself more in the scientific approach. And what it did was reject the idea of the politics administration dichotomy, but replace it with a more nuanced version of it known as kind of the fact-value distinction. However, Waldo once again finds problems with, again, pushing more towards science and this fact-value distinction. He argued what this is basically more skillful manipulation. Much like Mayo basically updated Taylor's vision, and he updated it through more skillful manipulation. That's exactly what Waldo is seeing what the behavioral approach did. And that it also dehumanized individuals. And he rejected this notion of fact-value distinction, and really one of his main problems was this notion of the blind man and the elephant analogy. And so what the behavioral approach did by focusing so much on science was through this process of something called reductionism. Now, reductionism is a huge tool in applying science to social affairs. And so what you do is look at a whole like an organization and reduce it to its parts. And by reducing it to its parts, we never really understand the whole anymore. And so what you have is basically a blind man who's touching a part of the elephant. But the blind man is never able to see the whole, never able to really see the public interest or the common good, because they're merely looking at concepts like rules or standardization or division of labor. Again, they're separating the various parts of what makes a whole and trying to understand it through that. Waldo rejects that. And he also makes another startling argument that there is no one theory of administration, that there are a variety of ways to understand administrative practices. And so what you get is when you pull back and look at the debates of the field, and what you see is some reoccurring debates. One is this idea of hierarchy versus equality, with the vision of progressive public administration grounded in large bureaucracies. What you have is this idea of hierarchy. But alongside this progressive vision, you have a constitutional tradition rooted in this idea of liberty and equality and devolving power to the people, not to organizations. And so when you look at some of these reoccurring debates, what you see is that administration has become political, and you really see that administrators become a huge force in regulating society. And so some of the central problems is, how do modern societies, rooted in this idea of hierarchy and discipline, also can incorporate notions of equality and liberty, and whether this is even possible or not. And what Waldo really articulated was trying to reform the system. Didn't believe in this evolutionary stance or trying to revolt against these large bureaucracies, just wanted to reform them to make them more compatible with our democratic norms. And so this gets to some central questions of whether unelected bureaucrats can govern legitimately. And in many ways, this is the constant debate we have concerning judges. Judges are unelected, but yet they have a tremendous amount of power in not only interpreting statutes, but also interpreting the Constitution itself. And bureaucrats are just like judges in the sense that they are unelected, but yet wield a tremendous amount of power. Through our consent, we have given powers to the president and to Congress, and we allow them to pass regulations, laws, and statutes that restrict our own liberty for the common good. But the question is, who has given these bureaucrats permission to boss me around? So what we have is 4 bureaucratic problems. What we have is a responsibility problem, that they often become so large, so huge, that they are immune from popular control. Related to that is this idea of responsiveness, that we've invested so much authority in their hands. Are they really responsive to the public good, to even elected politicians, or even to the people? Or are they more responsive to special interest groups, to large nonprofits, to corporations? Who exactly are they responding to? And then thirdly is you have a representation problem. Is that oftentimes, kind of this is related to the second one, is that agencies become captured, that they no longer represent the common good, but they represent narrow interest. And finally, again, is this idea of a centralized bureaucracy versus decentralized democracies. Now, the traditional response to these problems was the dichotomy, was that if you insulated administrators from the political process, you could resolve a lot of these problems of representation, of responsiveness, because ideally what administrators would be responsive to would be politicians, that they listen to them. Once they receive their marching orders, what they figure out is how to get it done. But we've kind of figured out that this really did not happen, even though the idea was to restore kind of the quality of administration, to allow them to develop into professionals, to use their technical expertise, hire based on merit, not patronage. What we see is not the realization of this dream, at least according to Waldo. That is his particular argument. And so instead of subordinating public administration to a clear line of command, this really doesn't happen. Again, according to Waldo, if you believe in the classical approach or the behavior approach, these are oftentimes good tools that the dichotomy would articulate, is that that administration is subordinated to politics, that through the clear line of command, through decentralization of responsibilities, is what we get as administrators who can apply public ends in a faithful manner. Well, again, Waldo kind of rejected these lines of argument. And what Waldo did very well was really offer a critique of these problems. He really laid bare some of the certain issues in the classical and behavioral understanding of public administration, but he didn't really offer new solutions. However, individuals who were deeply influenced by Waldo began to really come up with solutions to these problems. And there are really 2 dominant approaches from a Waldonian perspective. One is the rise of new public administration. Now, new public administration came about through the works of George Frederickson, who was a student of Waldo. And then the other approach is the refounding of public administration. And these were a group of scholars at Virginia Tech who released something called the Blacksburg Manifesto. Gary Walmsley was the individual who really was the leader of this particular group, who was also deeply influenced by Waldo. And so what we're going to do is, for the rest of the lecture, is go over these two approaches. So what we have, again, is a continuing debate within the field about Jacksonian administration and Wilsonian administration. Now, in many ways, it tends to be easy to reject Jacksonian administration, that it's too political, filled with patronage, it's corrupt. But one thing that the Jacksonian vision does very well is it allows administration to be tied to the people. And that's because it's built on the idea of representation and responsiveness. Now, in many ways, we have not let these values go. In fact, we can't let them go in a democratic society. We want the bureaucracy, we want administration to be reflected of the will of the people. And one way to do that is through these values. Well, we also have a uniquely powerful set of values that believes that the bureaucracy, that administration, should be neutrally competent, that should be based upon expertise. In many ways, we have viewed these competing ideals and values as a zero-sum game. We can have one, but we can't have the other. New public administration tends to push the idea that we could have both. But again, this can be a critique that's leveled against new public administration. Can we really have our cake and eat it too? Are they going to be idealistic in the vision they push forward? So the vision they develop, and which they call is basically new public administration, arose from something called the Minnowbrook Conference that was organized by Waldo. And these group of scholars came from the New Left of the 1960s. And the New Left was very much oriented towards Marxism. Well, this contingency was very much a non-Marxist element of the Democratic Party. And what they really sought to do was kind of update progressivism. You know, we've kind of articulated that progressivism was very much rooted in the idea of using big government. Well, what they're going to do, rooted in big government that was rooted in ideals of managerial efficiency. Well, they retain that idea that government could still be used as a force to achieve the public good. And what they did was maintain the idea of managerial efficiency, but they wanted to push for this idea of equality. In fact, that's what their chief rallying cry was, that the chief purpose of the state was equality. And this value is very much rooted in the 1960s. So what is new public administration? Again, it reinforces the idea of not disbanding or not letting go of managerial considerations, but what they wanted to do was now apply it to social equity. Now again, social equity is a very politically charged concept. And the idea is that how can we offer more or better services? And that really gets to the social equity standpoint. And then once we can come up with this idea of what it means to be equitable, then how can we do it in a more efficient and effective way? So in many ways, there's a particular critique of traditional public administration, that it's basically a tool that's used to favor the status quo or a narrow set of individuals. Kind of what Wilson labeled as clientele agencies that we've kind of talked about, or even regulatory agencies. And what the new public administration scholars articulated was that these organizations, by maintaining the status quo, actually do more harm than good. Well, what administrators can do is actually use their administrative apparatus to fight back against these large organizations. And what they can do is improve the quality of all by pushing this notion of social equity. And so instead of having the haves and the have-nots, what you have is administration becoming a tool to take from the haves and give it to the have-nots. In many ways, in conservative circles today, this would be basically called redistribution of wealth. And that's exactly what these new public administration scholars are doing, is redistributing benefits through the administrative apparatus. So again, By couching it in these terms, you see how politically charged this idea of social equity is. I do not want to underplay how political this is. So again, kind of to top this off, what administrators become is now representatives of the discriminated class, or representatives of the poor or middle class. And administration is now to be used as a tool against the rich. So again, you have a bureaucracy problem. The bureaucracy is too stable and in need of bureaucratic reform. And so what we want to do, and this is very much rooted in the spirit of the 1960s, is don't rely on institutions. You rely on individuals to make changes, and you rely on concrete problems. So what you want is to create modified bureaucracies to deal with individual projects. And so what PA should seek to do is to change policies and structures. So in general, what new public administration really sought to do was align with the good understood through the prism of social equity. And what you had to do is distinguish strongly between public and private organizations. And the public administration now becomes very much a political entity. Now, one metaphor to really kind of understand all of this is the idea of the Warren Court. So the Warren Court, again, as a judicial body, is undemocratic, that they're not officially elected by people through consent. But yet they bring about change in a constitutional manner. And that's exactly the role of public administration, that very much like the Warren Court, it should be active, not passive. It should be political, not non-political. And it should seek goals of equity. And that is this notion of what is new public administration. Well, Waldo said, hold on a second. He basically called this new romanticism, which basically means that this is great in theory, but can't be really applied to practice. That there are good people. He does agree with one critique, is that they are good people that are corrupted by bad institutions. And he had very much a sympathetic interest for these ideals, but yet he noted that it was too radical. And he also said it was elitist. By relying on technocrats, by relying on administrators to rule, basically what they're saying is you need a small group of individuals to fight against another small group of individuals. And he also noted that it simplified bureaucratic life too much. In particular, this is the critique that he had, that a critique against the new public administration stance on institutions. That institutions are more nuanced, more complex than this vision of the 1960s that all institutions are bad. Well, in response to new public administration, is you had another approach emerge called the Refounding, or something called basically the Blacksburg Manifesto. And what the Blacksburg Manifesto did was a call to refound public administration on democratic and republican principles. So while new public administration is rooted in progressive values, especially on this idea of equality, what the Blacksburg Manifesto argued was that we need to root public administration in the founding period, not in the progressive vision. And so what public servants, when kind of viewing this, is they basically argue that they are undervalued and diminished by both politicians and citizens alike. Now, in many ways, this constant bureaucratic bashing has led to a legitimacy crisis for the field. And what the Refounding wants to do is make public administration legitimate. And the way they're going to do this is to base it on the Constitution. So there's a variety of different strands of part of this Refounding project. It seeks to legitimize public administration by focusing on something they call the agency perspective. Another one is the constitutional perspective. Another dimension is the public interest perspective, and then finally a citizen one. Although these concepts do overlap and conflict, what they seek to do is create a context that sees administration as valuable. So the first perspective was articulated by Gary Walmsley, who's kind of the leader of this group who put out this Blacksburg Manifesto. And what he argues is that administrators are special citizens. And they are special not because they have special privileges, but that they have certain skills that allow them to stand for the public interest. In particular, they have institutional, historical, and political knowledge to serve as responsible agents. Now, in many ways, executives in this country, whether you serve as a governor or president, you're only in office for 48 years. Well, these bureaucrats are there for decades, and so they have institutional knowledge, they have historical knowledge, and they're very much tied to the political apparatus. And because of this, this allows them to act in a way that gives them, to a certain degree, foresight, prudence. And what Walmsley argues through this agency perspective, instead of viewing agencies as drawn down or dragged down by inertia, what we should see is individuals who can responsibly implement goals to achieve long-term interest. And one way to understand this also is that administrators should view themselves or view their responsibilities as a calling or as a vocation instead of as a career or job. That elevates them to find value in administration. And you need to find value in administration because it's currently, according to them, being degraded by forces that basically say that they're not responsive, that they're too political, that they're too slow, they're too inefficient, and too ineffective. What this agency perspective is trying to do is give them more credibility. Now, the constitutional perspective is kind of the second pillar that the refounding rests on. And this is kind of the heart of the refounding project. And so instead of basing public administration again on progressive values, where you legitimize the field through efficiency and effectiveness, how you should legitimize the field is by basing it on constitutional values. And so by doing this, what you avoid is that once an organization becomes ineffective or inefficient, it automatically becomes ineffective, especially when you view it through this progressive ideology. Well, under this constitutional perspective espoused by John Rohr, he argues that effectiveness and efficiency do matter, but what matters even more is that administrators protect individual rights. So the purpose of administration should be the purpose of the Constitution. And the central purpose of the Constitution is to secure, maintain our individual rights, such as freedom of speech, the free exercise clause, due process, the right to bear arms, all of these things that are wrapped around in the Bill of Rights, that administrators have a right to protect those. Now, in addition to that, there's this notion of promoting the public good that is also critically important. But the central idea of the Constitution is to limit government power. Now, in relation to upholding the purpose of the Constitution, Rohr also adds a very important element. He argues that administrators are also constitutional officers. They are constitutional officers because, at least for the federal ones, they swear an oath to support and to protect the Constitution. Now, when you look at the word oath, it has a lot of different meanings to it, but it's very much a religious concept in which somebody is tied to a particular idea or somebody else. So when you think of oaths that we provide in modern day society, you can still think of marriage, you can still think of baptism. And let's go down the marriage one. Is that when you are married, you give an oath to tie yourself to a particular person. And you have all of these things that you promise to do. Now, in many ways, that's exactly what public servants do, is they give an oath to the Constitution, that they will uphold the principles of the document. So in many ways, what administrators are to do, according to Rohr, is that they serve constitutional principles, not necessarily elected leaders. So again, let me counterbalance this off to the progressive vision of administration. Now, the progressive vision of administration viewed the president as the CEO of the nation, as the chief executive officer, and that the bureaucrats and administrators were solely responsible to this office. Rohr says no, that they are foremost responsible to the Constitution itself, to uphold the Constitution. Now, the president, like Congress and the courts, are constitutional officers, and by giving an oath to the Constitution, they become tied. The administrators also become tied to the Constitution. And so what they have to do is use their discretionary powers to maintain a balance of powers, to maintain the basic guiding ethical framework that the Constitution sets up, like federalism, like separation of powers, all designed to support individual rights. So in building upon the argument of how administrators are constitutional officers, he notes that there are 22 ways to hold office under the Constitution. So in many ways, we view that really the only way to hold office under the Constitution is through democratic elections, through this principle of consent. Well, the founders created a system where consent is only one way to become a constitutional officer. There are also 22 other ways, and each way grants authority. And Rohr also kind of stipulates this, kind of describing it more fully, is that the president is not a steward of the people. The president does not derive his power from the people. He derives his power from the Constitution. The Constitution derives its power from the people. And that's a critical element of understanding where power comes from. And because the ultimate source of power comes from the people, but the people grant their power to the Constitution, and then the Constitution grants their power to the president, to Congress, to the courts, and to administration. So in many ways, the president, like any other officers, is a steward to the Constitution. And that's exactly what administrators should do, is that they are a steward to the Constitution. Therefore, their immediate boss, or their overall boss, is not the president, not Congress or the courts, but the Constitution. So they must work to preserve and defend it. And these are the values that they are supposed to work to defend. And that's this notion of separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, and rights. In many ways, what this perspective does is really, again, ennoble administrators. That now they become not just mere bureaucrats, but also constitutional officers. Now, the third perspective to understand the refounding is this notion of public interest. Now, they understand that defining public interest is very difficult, especially in a pluralistic society where there's competing ideas of what is the good. So instead of focusing on a utilitarian concept of what is the greatest good for the greatest number of people, what they really want to focus on is process. Now, administrators have the tools to conduct process in a very legal and moral way. That if you follow process, what you can do is maintain the long-term interest of the states. The final perspective, the fourth pillar of the refounding, is this notion of a citizen perspective. And oftentimes it's easy to forget about the citizen when we talk about administrative affairs. Even though administration is created to serve the people, we often forget this important dimension. And what this dimension really pushes at is that administrators should engage with citizens, work to encourage them to participate, to interact, so they know various problems and know how to solve them. And so what you see what the refounding does is try to elevate administration to a constitutional level, but also forces both politicians and citizens to interact more with the administrative process. So in summary, what you get out of the Blacksburg Manifesto is a call to reground the field on constitutional values. And it is a call to find value in public administration. Instead of demeaning our public servants, what the refounding pushes us to elevate them, to view them in a distinguished light, but also in a realistic light, that they do make mistakes, sometimes they are corrupt, sometimes they are unaccountable. But what this approach tries to do is to elevate public service in order to make them more accountable to the values that we hold dear. And so, again, it's a call to find the public interest. And you can really see the distinguishing elements between new public administration and the refounding. Although they both come from Waldo, they are very different, and it's important to know these distinctions. So let's kind of summarize the first half of the course so far. Is what we've really tried to do is trace administrative development from basically the early 20th century, kind of the birth of progressivism, all the way through the 20th century. And what we really have seen is a transition from traditional bureaucracy to one that tries to personalize it, to one that reforms it, and now one that tries to refound it. And so each of these strands impacts administration in a different way. And what you get is practitioners and scholars are divided into these camps. And each of these camps are legitimate, but that doesn't necessarily mean all of them are right. And what you need to do is decide which particular camp is adequate, which ones answers particular questions that you're addressed with, and what fits with how you view what administration, the role that administration should have in our own in our own lives. So some of the continuing questions that we are still dealing with is, what is the relationship between public administration and business? Does it primarily relate to the public sector using private sector techniques? And are organizations really just organizations, or are they more political entities used to accomplish certain public ends? And really, how different are public and private entities? Some say there is no distinction at all. Others say they are very, very different. Another recurring question is whether administration is more scientific or more political. Again, if you're from a classical approach, you'll answer that question differently if you're viewing it more from Waldo's perspective. So again, science is rooted in this idea of prediction and objectivity. And you can really see why we have gravitated toward this understanding. If you look at basically an educational standpoint, we want our children who are in K through 12 education, we want to develop policies that allow us to be able to predict that they will do well. And that's the whole idea behind No Child Left Behind, is using administrative tools to become more scientific. Now, the concept of the political is slightly different, is that you can't reduce administration to prediction. You can't use standardized tests to be able to predict future performance in schools or even future performance in a workplace environment. What administration is inherently political. And this really gets both to the refounding and new public administration standpoint, is that civil servants help decide who gets what, when, and how. And if administration is that political, how do you contain it? How do you control it? Do you use constitutional norms to constrain it, or do you use managerial values to constrain it? And then also, does administration make us less free? And this gets back to Weber's central contribution of, is bureaucracy an iron cage? Does it cripple us? Does it inhibit our creativity, our innovation, our entrepreneurial spirits? And are individuals who work for these large public organizations transformed into cogs, into tools to be merely used to achieve a particular end? Or does administration actually make us more free? Do they give us the tools to actually cultivate us, to change who we are for the better? And then a huge one is, how do we reconcile democracy with bureaucracy? Because they are based on different value sets. And do we want to make bureaucracies more open and democratic? And if we do, what are the consequences? Is it going to lead to less efficiency, less effectiveness? And if it is, are we going to accept that? And looking at the final question is, how do we organize? Now, we've looked at a variety of different models and approaches to understanding this basic question, yet it still remains unresolved. But that doesn't mean we don't have great ideas of what we should be doing. And we can go all the way back to the very kind of first models that we talked about in terms of Weber and Taylor. Does scientific management, is that the one best way to organize? Or going to Simon and to Lindblom is, how do we make decisions within those organizations? Should organizations seek to shape our premises? In many ways, this is very invasive, but according to Simon, what it does is enable us to make better decisions that will increase productivity. Or should we follow more of a conservative model of making incremental and mutually adjusted changes? And then finally, when we look at how to organize, what role should the political play? Should it be kept out, or should it be incorporated? And if we do incorporate it, how do we constrain administrative action where it doesn't become too political? Again, these are all questions of how we go about organizing our public lives. So once again, I look forward to hearing your responses on the discussion boards and seeing kind of where you fall in the traditions of public administration. Do you agree with Taylor? What about Simon? What about Waldo? Again, don't be afraid to take a point of view and defend it, and also even try to undermine another position. So I look forward to hearing your comments on the discussion boards.